Now that it's finally here, we don't really want it.
Right. Yeah.
We have how many people do we have? 16 on the call?
16 so far.
That's pretty sweet.
Nice.
And we're still running the live streams, correct, Jeff?
What's that?
We're still running the live streams, correct?
Ooh, actually, we should be.
Did you spin that up already, Arsh, or does
Yeah,
it need to?
yeah. I'm going
I think I got a notification.
Yeah, I'm going
Okay.
I'm going to troubleshoot real quick, so I'm going to make you host and rejoin the call, Bradley.
Okay.
Come on.
It's funny because I mean I've worked from home for the majority of the past 10 years. So really the only difference is my wife is around now.
Yep.
And how does she feel about that?
No comment.
Yeah, ditto.
professional market. I think students are even more difficult to talk with unless they know about the group, but perhaps there's a lower barrier of entry for them to hop on a Zoom call rather than, show up in person. So I think there's a lot of interesting opportunity with going to this format for a while.
Whereas the merits are they speak for themselves for someone like who's a formal recruiter like Brian, or like an informal recruiter like myself, where I'm always looking for the next team member, right? Even if I'm not in a hiring position, it's still, you're growing your network, you're building relationships that may pay off in 15 years. You never know. Like it's a fertile market for relationships. Absolutely.
I was just having a conversation earlier today with a developer in an agency setting, talking about how those relationships that are 18 months in the making actually are really paying off now and are paying dividends now. As everybody's hunkering down, people want to do business with those that they know and have a relationship with.
Yeah, and I mean, from like a straight business perspective, when I was building my consulting company, the largest projects I got took 2 years to track down. So it doesn't surprise me, 2 years from the time I have like an informal conversation to doing an analysis and building like formal documentation to like signing contracts, right? So it doesn't necessarily surprise me that, it takes 16, 18 months to get to know somebody and build something. And if we're looking, at the trajectory of building out the developer economy, right? I think one of the challenges within the startup ecosystem is that there's a lot of energy toward the sort of generic, build a company and shoot for the moon. But there's not a lot of energy put into practitioners, right? So when I say practitioners, I mean, in my mind, when two developers decide to get together and build something, they have everything they need, right? They need GitHub and time, and to get together and build stuff and build those proof of concepts. And so in my mind, right, when I'm thinking about building out the economy and how do we really lead this organization towards starting to build companies that survive in the future and grow, it's like, well, we need to establish those relationships where people start projects together. They have a friendship and somebody, pitches something at a happy hour, Jason, and they just start working on a project. And, if it grows legs, that's awesome. And I honestly think that in a lot of cases, that's how projects start. I think the sort of Silicon Valley way of thinking of, raise a bunch of financing and stuff, I think that works for those areas where, that's sort of the thought. And it can work here, but on a more like grassroots kind of perspective and being removed from, high volumes of funding, it works by two people getting together and starting to work on stuff and tinker together and share information back and forth and build relationships. And so, that's the fundamental, right? You network to find people to share interests, to find jobs, or to work on projects together.
It's the Palo Alto garage, a couple guys in a garage story all over again. The difference being that the garage is virtual. There is no spoon.
Well, on that note, it's just about 7:15, so maybe we should kick this off. I am super happy to have Praneet with us tonight. And Praneet, you're going to have to help me with pronunciation on both your last name and the company name. Is it Loki?
Yes, it is Loki.
Okay. Praneet Loki, and the company, do you say Plumie?
Yes, it is Plumie.
Okay. So Praneet is going to be talking to us tonight about, I think we condensed it down into essentially the most recent tools that every cloud developer should be using. I know just a little about the company, but I'm really excited to hear, how you guys got started and how you built the tools that you're using.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking me to be a part of this meetup. Super stoked to be talking to you guys. From for folks in Alaska. Um, so the need for Plumie came about because like our founder Joe Duffy was actually part of. He's been a Microsoft lifer. Pretty much everyone, all of our executives at the company are former Microsoft executives, including Eric Rudder, who was a former, I think, SVP of Azure and Xbox and Office and SQL Server. And then Joe Duffy was a former project manager on .NET Core, and shortly before he left Microsoft, he led the project to open source .NET, which became .NET Core. And our CTO, Lou Coben, was one of the original members of TC39, which is the committee that stewards TypeScript and adds TypeScript or language features to TypeScript itself. So a lot of history around programming languages itself. A lot of these guys worked on the core.NET runtime, designing like C tools for Microsoft and working on developer tools and whatnot. But there was a huge gap when you come to the cloud development space. There wasn't really much going on in terms of developer tools. And so Joe Duffy and Eric are the co-founders of Plumie, and they had this idea that it really sucks to build for the cloud, because you build this really awesome app, but then when it comes down to deploying something to the cloud, your experience really goes down to zero, and it's pretty awful. And so they set out to build a tool, and that's how Plumie came about. The name Plumie itself, there's some story behind that. I will leave that to you guys to discover as an Easter egg. It is on Joe Duffy's blog. So I'm gonna get started just kind of talking through what the state of the cloud is today. And this is by far not the most exhaustive information that you can find about cloud tools. But what I would like to think of it is this is a brief look, and I'm sure that this will make every one of you kind of think about how you're using the cloud, if you are using the cloud, and if you're not using the cloud, maybe it's time that you should start to do something with cloud services. Whether you're a front-end developer or you're a content developer, and you want to kind of up your game in terms of programming. So a little bit about myself. So I'm a software engineer at Plumie, of course, and that is also a disclaimer because I'm also going to be speaking about Plumie itself, as well as some competitor tools as well. But by no means am I trying to trash talk our competitors, because I think that everyone can coexist here, and there's a specific use for all of these tools. So I've been building a lot of cloud services for the last few years. I've worked primarily in marketing automation, so doing omnichannel marketing. So basically sending emails, texts, push notifications, and showing like banners, and trying to do predictions on user behavior and things like that, to drive customer engagement, and doing like in-product messaging to drive trial conversions and upsells and things like that. So at Plumie, I work on our SaaS platform. That's plumie.com, or specifically app.plumie.com. It is equivalent to a cloud console, kind of like AWS or GCP console, if you've ever used any of those. And I also work on our CLI, which is kind of like the front-facing tool that developers will most likely end up using. So I primarily work with Go and TypeScript these days, but I've worked a lot with Java, .NET, less with Ruby and Python, just because they're not my favorite languages, and do a lot with JavaScript as well. But of course, most of my uses of JavaScript have been replaced with TypeScript itself these days. So I wanted to start us off with a very quick poll. So there is a link in the Zoom chat. If you wouldn't mind clicking that, and the active poll question should be, do you use any cloud services? And
can you post that link again? I joined after the link was posted and I can't seem to see it.
Oh yeah, sure. Let me get that. Whoop. And how do I get the Zoom chat? There we go. All right. I'll just give a few seconds for everyone to kind of click that and navigate.
How open of a question is, do you use any cloud services? We're talking like a web dev specifically?
Just if you use Heroku, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, even if you just create like an S3 bucket, and that's pretty much as far as your exposure goes, and you're out of there and onto your web development, that's fine too. So just any kind of like touch points that you have with cloud.
Gotcha. Okay, cool.
Okay, great. So we'll move on. It seems that about 93% of you have used some sort of cloud services that fall into some category, which we'll kind of try to find what kind of cloud services that you use as we go on throughout this presentation. So I kind of wanted to start off with what is the state of cloud deployment as it is today? So if you take the big three cloud providers that are out there, you take AWS, Azure, and GCP, and you have a few options to deploy, any resources or services as they call them. And so AWS has CloudFormation templates. Azure has ARM templates, which is Azure Resource Manager. And then Google Cloud has Deployment Manager templates. So the key key thing here is all of these are templates. So therefore, they're sort of template-based deployment technologies. They use some combination of scripts and CLIs, and the templates themselves being either JSON-based or YAML-based templates. And if any of you have tried to deploy anything using like one of these templates, these can get pretty gnarly as you try to, expand the kind of dependencies that you have on a specific cloud. So you may start with S3 bucket, for example, on AWS. And so you start off with a tiny template, but then you quickly realize that, hey, I want to add a, I don't know, an RDS cluster or like a database cluster, or I want to add a notification service. And so your template is going to grow pretty quickly. And then you're probably going to hit a roadblock. And then you're going to try to figure out, oh, I could maybe try to use some scripts here to try and automate some deployments. And so maybe you have some spaghetti code, bash scripts or PowerShell scripts if you're using Azure to use one of their Azure PowerShell modules. And then combined with, just some random CLI commands that you probably copied and pasted all throughout the tutorials. And this is actually not a dig at developers, right, for doing this. This is actually because the cloud providers have not had a good way for developers to deploy to the cloud. For a long time, cloud providers themselves have focused so much on expanding the services that they offer to developers. But really, the developer experience of deploying these things have been traditionally poor. And so, you're scraping the web, trying to figure out how to deploy things. And as developers, this is what we do. We're trying to find answers. We come across a tutorial, you come across a sample, you come across Stack Overflow posts, and the end result is you have a deployment process that is as complicated as your search for answers was. You probably spent a whole day trying to figure out why can't I get my database to be deployed first before I can deploy my service. Getting from point A to point B, you probably did 20 different things, and your deployment process is therefore as complicated as those 20 different things. And then there's some cloud providers that are kind of smaller than these big players. Take DigitalOcean, for example. They've got some of the best tutorials that you can find online. And that's right after, I guess, Heroku. Heroku also has some pretty good, documentation. But that's also kind of a bad thing because, who has time to like go through pages and pages of documentation, walking through step by step, looking at the screenshot to see if you're at that exact step that they're talking about in the tutorial, right? And you're trying to figure out if you entered the value the same way that the tutorial is asking you to enter the value, and you're trying to figure out if what you have looks exactly the way that the tutorial is showing you. And so that's yet another fragile process of trying to deploy something to the cloud. And so even though the tutorials themselves are a step above the rest and are neatly organized, with some of these cloud providers, still not the best because it's a mix of running arbitrary CLI commands, and once again you're probably going to string up a few scripts and combined with some manual steps. So speaking of manual steps, so if you're not doing any of the template-based deployments, pretty much every developer entering cloud development space starts off with the ever popular console. The first thing that you do is you go to aws.amazon.com, you sign up, and you're taken to the AWS console. Same thing with Azure. You go to portal.azure.com, or for Google, console.google cloud or whatever. And you're there, you're clicking around, you're creating your S3 bucket. Great, it's done. But you've just done what what the tutorial is prescribing you to do, or you've gone to the UI and you've actually achieved what you wanted to do. But let's say that you're growing, your idea has taken off, or your prototype in a small team has grown out to become an actual project, or you're working for a client and the client is asking you to repeat something that you've done previously, for a different project, right? If you have a consulting firm and you're working with clients, it's quick and easy when you first do it. There's not much for you to research. You maybe follow the wizard steps that the console offers you, but then and as developers go, pretty much every developer has a very strong opinion about which console is the best and which one's shitty. And so pretty much any developer you ask will pick a side and stick to that about which console they like. As consoles go, they are hard to make repeatable steps out of, right? You do something, and now you're trying to produce steps to tell your colleague or your friend, hey, no, go to console.amazon.com, log in, click on S3, click on bucket, click on enable encryption, make sure you've disabled public read access policy, make sure that you've set the tags, make sure that you've added, you've enabled like encryption by default, you've enabled versioning on the buckets, and it's just like, it keeps going on. And so it's just a replacement for the fragile system that the templates and scripts were offering you. Although compared to console-based deployments, as people don't realize, doing template-based deployments is probably a step better, just because you're not relying on someone's memory to try and figure out, what someone did, or how, Joe or, whoever on the team tried to create something, or created something last week and then they're on vacation today, and you're trying to figure out how they did something, right? And so I guess before we go on to the next section, and I see that some of you have gotten a jump start and have been answering some of the questions, or this question, specifically, which cloud provider do you use the most? And this is a follow-up to the first one. If you're just joining us, the first one was about whether or not you're using a cloud service. And this one is specifically about which one you have used. And it can be in any capacity. Doesn't have to be that you're using it every day, just to get an idea of what you've used. So we'll give folks a few more seconds to answer that. I still see responses coming in. I'll give a few more seconds. Great. People can continue responding to that question, but I'll just read out the responses right now. So AWS is a clear winner here at 53%, and followed by DigitalOcean at 20%. That's quite interesting. And then the rest were at 7%. So I'm actually not surprised that a lot of people use AWS. It could be because of word of mouth, or just plain and simple, people believe that that is the best cloud provider out there, and they won't be wrong in terms of depending on which service you use and what type of experience you first had when you first started using it. And so the next one that I kind of wanted to talk about, this isn't really about, this one is not specifically deploying, infrastructure. You're not deploying databases, you're not deploying CDN, you're not deploying, like Lambda or whatever. But these are like whole packaged solutions for deploying a backend, as they call it. So if you're writing a mobile app, you're, for example, you're a mobile developer, or you're, someone was asking me, if you're doing web development and you use some cloud, right? And maybe your experience of using cloud hasn't been great. So these services like Darklang, which was recently just announced, and in fact, I think they're still in sort of a public beta mode. But these are kind of like a WYSIWYG type of IDs that you can use to deploy APIs and and storage for your front end apps. So think like Firebase Store, but a step beyond that. So these allow you to kind of create, like I said, one-click deployment of APIs and try to really speed up the deployment, going from 0 to 100, really fast. And the other one, kind of not as frequently heard, is Backendless, which has actually been around for quite some time, actually. Again, the same concept. They're not really, you're not really deploying infrastructure, but it's like this whole IDE and packaged environment where they do everything. You're kind of locked into, how they do things. And so going into either of these tools, you kind of have to be okay with the vendor lock-in, if you've heard of that terminology. If you invest too much in these and these companies go belly up, you're kind of screwed. With no path forward in terms of like migrating to another cloud provider, just because they're very niche in what they do. And Backendless specifically is nothing to do with the serverless architecture itself, although I'm sure that they will be more than happy to redefine the word serverless, because in a way, I guess their offering is also serverless. So all of those slides basically were leading up to this one, which is, all of the current, really popular approaches, or and like as developers get started on the cloud, the approaches that they're made familiar with don't really treat infrastructure as code. And even though you may have come across that terminology when you were going about using perhaps CloudFormation templates or ARM templates, or maybe you actually have used one of these tools. Maybe you have come across Terraform, you've heard of it, or use it even, in fact. And the idea is that you're treating infrastructure as code. You're doing version control. You're using these platforms, or like what these frameworks provide as as code, to represent your infrastructure as code. So the idea of these tools is you're creating repeatable, consistent, repeatable, and reusable infrastructure code. And it takes the guesswork out of creating infrastructure. It also, in some cases, it also allows you to write testable infrastructure code. So it kind of bridges that gap between what developers are trained to do. As a front-end developer or a back-end developer, you probably have adopted principles in your team to do unit tests. Let's have 60% coverage for unit tests, and you probably have policies in place that fail, maybe a merge or a prod build if code coverage drops, or static analysis fails, and whatnot, right? Like, why can't we apply that same methodology to infrastructure, and start treating infrastructure as code, and get all that goodness that code brings to the table for writing apps. So the three tools are kind of similar in their objectives, but there's some really stark differences between specifically HashiCorp Terraform and what Plumie and AWS CDK do. As you can see, like, I've tried to illustrate with the table that all three tools are trying to set out to do to provide to make you create reusable code, because creating a static website or infrastructure for a static website, or for an API service, can be reused to deploy that API service for a different project. And then there's this concept of state diffing, which is you've deployed your infrastructure, and you're trying to make some changes now. And so there's this idea of the current state and then the to be state, and then trying to diff that to show you that, hey, the consequence of you changing something in the infrastructure is that all of these other resources need to be changed. And some of these resources cannot just be changed in place, they need to be dropped and recreated. Right. And so in terms of infrastructure, not everything can be updated in place, unlike our applications that are deployed on app servers. And so things like databases and CDN and stuff, and some other resources may require downtime. And depending on your application, you may not be able to afford downtime. And so it's important to know when you make changes, what sort of impact it's going to have on your cloud services itself. And so all three tools provide a sort of state diffing, and inform you earlier, rather than trying to get paged as your infrastructure is coming down right in front of your eyes in the middle of the deployment. And so the third one is proprietary language, and this one is really important because the adoption of tools, is really high when developers don't have to learn something new. and they can take what they already know and then just quickly ramp up to a new tool without having to relearn or learn something that they have never seen before. And something with, and that's very true with when you compare with Terraform with Plumie and AWS CDK. The concept of Plumie and AWS CDK is that you're not really learning a new language. You're using existing programming languages and what those programming languages bring to the table with your infrastructure code. So languages like JavaScript or TypeScript or Python, Go, C#.net, and you're probably already using one of these to write applications. Maybe you have a React or Angular app and you're using TypeScript for that, or you have a Spring Boot app and you're writing Java for that, right? Or an ASP.NET site and you're writing C#. Wouldn't it be awesome if you also were able to write your infrastructure to host your ASP.NET site, or an ASP.NET Web API, and write the infrastructure for that in the same .NET Core or C#.NET specifically, and just have everything in one uniform landscape. And it actually also has a consequence on like your your team size, and because now you're talking about a small team that really doesn't have the capacity to or like the financial capacity to hire someone that can specifically do DevOps. You're basically extending the knowledge of infrastructure to your existing developers, and your developers are basically doing, trying to do infrastructure as well in smaller teams. And again, the story is very different for enterprises, because enterprises really have some strict controls in place, and so this is probably not always true for that. Um, and so Terraform uses HCL, which is HashiCorp configuration language, and it's a form of JSON-based DSL. It's not really a language in the sense that it's not a programming language. And it's a DSL, and so there is a slow ramp up to that. It is not as bad as any other DSL, but it is a DSL. It comes with limitations, and you will hit those limitations as your team grows and your application grows, and you're trying to do a lot with the cloud. And the last one is it kind of talks to the language aspect of these tools, which is do they support popular languages, and popular languages such as Go these days is really popular, C#.NET, TypeScript, Python, and Python is super popular among specifically like web developers and developers that want to get started really fast. It's that hacky mentality, and like really doesn't come in your way a lot type of language. And so and both Pulumi and AWS CDK support that. In fact, actually, AWS CDK supports one extra language, which is Java. Pulumi doesn't support that yet, but we're talking about adding support for JVM, and maybe sometime soon we'll have that. But that's one of the things with AWS CDK is, or even Pulumi, is that you can use your familiar languages. You don't really have to relearn anything. The one really important difference between Pulumi and CDK itself is CDK is specific to AWS, whereas Pulumi is by default, because Pulumi is not tied to a specific cloud provider. You're actually just writing language agnostic infrastructure code that just spans across any provider, like whichever provider that you choose. So providers being AWS, Azure, GCP, DigitalOcean. We even have providers that are not actually traditional cloud providers. So it could even be that you want to automate creation of GitHub repositories or GitLab pipelines. You could do that also with Plumie, and so you get that benefit of not using CDK. And unlike CDK, actually, between Plumie and CDK itself, CDK, when you write something in a programming language, it actually gets synthesized. There's a step to synthesize that into CloudFormation templates. And so that's how AWS is able to not reinvent their CloudFormation API to support CDK. And so it kind of compiles down into or generates these CloudFormation templates, and then behind the scenes, the AWS CLI is actually trying to execute that CloudFormation template for you. But then you get a much friendlier experience writing the programming language for your infrastructure. Whereas Plumie does not do that transformation. Your code stays as is. To you as an end user, I guess it doesn't really make a difference whether or not it transpiles into something. But the benefit is that once again, you can't really use AWS CDK if you like DigitalOcean, or if you need to use DigitalOcean because of a pricing difference. You can't really use AWS CDK there. You're kind of out of luck there. And at that point, your only options are either Terraform or Plumie. And depending on whether you want to use a DSL or a programming language, you can choose one or the other. And I kind of wanted to show the difference. And I'm also at the end of this. But what does this all look like? And this is by no means, not even like scratching the surface. Like this is not even 1% of what either of these tools are capable of. But I just kind of wanted to place them side by side and contrast. What does it look like to create something with a programming language, and then something with on the left with Terraform, and then Plumie on the right side with the programming language, and you can see that it's like for any web developers among us, if you're using if you're writing a Node.js based backend, or you're writing a TypeScript based app, the syntax should be very familiar to you, because it's just plain TypeScript. It's importing packages, npm packages at the top. You'll recognize the module fs because it's just Node.js. There's nothing special, so you can pretty much import any Node.js package, including path, URL, node fetch, whichever one that you want to import, and then creating a new bucket, specifying the properties. And again, because this is TypeScript, you get rich type support, so you don't have to keep referring to the documentation to see, trying to figure out what does a bucket resource take. I forget the name of the property, and I forget like what is the type of that property's value. And trying to understand or trying to remember what it should be, right? And you get all of this because that's the thing with programming languages is you get this out of the box, and there's nothing specific to like Plumie that we're doing here, other than basically exposing the APIs of the underlying cloud provider itself. And I also kind of wanted to show the AWS CDK also, a similar example of what I showed in this slide, what it is like to do that in CDK. And I actually could not fit the whole example in this thing, because the example is actually pretty big. So I omitted some lines for the sake of brevity. But to their credit, though, actually the example that they have is a real world complete example, because it also involves, like, the lines that I omitted actually had to do with creating an SSL certificate, binding that to the buckets domains, and then like enforcing like policies and things like that. And so it's a more real world, secure, complete example that I would actually be comfortable using that on my own. Whereas these two are just to kind of highlight, really quickly what you can do. I wouldn't say that either of these are complete real world examples, like what you should do in order to create a secure website. And so you can see that, like, again, the power of programming language to create a reusable a reusable class called static site. And the idea is that you've created this component class that represents a static site. You can use that to create any number of static sites going forward. You're not really passing around templates or scripts for someone to try and understand, or even for yourself, coming back 3 months later and trying to understand PowerShell scripts or DSL or templates is going to be really hard compared to just walking through some TypeScript. You're pretty much going to easily pick up, what's really going on. And so lastly, I kind of wanted to end the presentation today with the last question, which I'll activate right now, which is, how do you deploy your services to the cloud today? And it's an open-ended question. There's just to kind of get an idea of what is the popular method that people use today. It could be you go in and click around the console and just hope that everything turns green, or it could be that, hey, I use Terraform today, or I use CDK, or I use CLI, or I actually heard about Plumie and I've been wanting to check it out. So it could be any of those. So my favorite one so far is Hope and Pray, which I can relate to that because in my past jobs I prayed a lot, and I can tell you that those prayers were not answered. Yeah, it's great to see some folks have used Terraform. A lot of you are also talking about going into the console and clicking on things to deploy things manually, and so. I also see someone using CodeStar or Code Pipeline. That's actually an interesting point about using CI/CD to deploy infrastructure, and that actually is a whole another topic of using CI/CD itself, and specifically in today's presentation, in the context of today's presentation, like if you're not using one of these tools, then even within your CI/CD, unless it's AWS code build or code deploy, you're probably going to have to write scripts that get invoked in CI/CD pipelines, and once again, that means you're going to have to try and grok like Bash scripts and PowerShell scripts, which can become quite gnarly. Great. So I'll leave that open, but in the interest of time, I'm gonna kind of wrap up here. But feel free to keep answering. I'm enjoying actually reading the responses. It's also kind of humorous. But yeah, so that's all that I had for today. I kind of wanted to walk everyone through the state of the cloud as I began this presentation. It's walking you through all the ways that you can deploy to the cloud versus all the modern tools or like tools that are up and coming today, including the ones that I work on at Plumie. But I kind of wanted to provide an impartial view of how you can up your game of deploying to the cloud, and also pick up some really cool skills in addition to working on your application, web app or mobile app or console application. um, you know um, so yeah, thank you for listening to me tonight, but if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So
Thank you,
I don't know.
Praneet.
Yeah.
Yeah, great presentation. And I see Nick has already asked a question in the Zoom group chat. So I think given how many of us there are in here, that would be the best way to ask a question. And Praneet, you can just maybe read it out and give your answer.
Sure. Yeah. So I see.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'll read the question.
Sure. Yeah.
And you can answer it. So Nick asks, I frequently use Python scripts in lieu of Bash. It's a lot more verbose, but more readable and maintainable. Is there maybe a question in there about use of Python and in some of the infrastructure you're talking about? We'll let Nick maybe come back with if there's a question or just comment. Anybody else?
There's a question from the stream. Noah Williams asks, do you consider Ansible as an infrastructure as code tool?
Yeah, no, it actually is. That actually brings up a great point about tools that are right for the job. And so there's actually a whole suite of other tools that I did not even mention. Tools like Puppet, Chef, Ansible, Packer, they all exist to serve a specific purpose. And so I don't think that I definitely think that they're all infrastructure as code in their own right. But I would say that Ansible is more for provisioning VMs than it is for general infrastructure. So if you had to like try and work outside of VMs, I think it'd be pretty hard for you to do that with Ansible itself.
Great. Nick has come back with a follow-up, wanting to know how useful Python is for scripting cloud installations together. I kind of would dovetail a question of my own in with that, which is, do you have equal functionality in all of these languages as you've implemented them, or are some more feature rich than others?
No, that's a great question. So our first the first programming language that we supported was obviously TypeScript, just given its popularity, and then immediately followed with Python. So in terms of feature parity, within speaking from the speaking as a Plumie employee, I guess I can say that there are certain features that are not there in Python, but Python is super popular. Our community Slack is very active in the Python community, and so we've been spending a lot of time enabling a lot of features in Python. It is under very heavy active development, and so we're constantly adding features to it. And we've it is there's even packages that we create that we have created specifically for TypeScript in the beginning, last year, and then we've ported those over to Python as well, and so we're trying to add more support for more features in Python itself.
Great. Question from Jason Warda. How does serverless fit into the picture versus Plumie or CDK?
Yeah, another great question. So yeah, serverless is its own monster, really. There's whole businesses built around serverless. There's also serverless.com, which is this really popular framework that allows you to do just serverless things. But that's, you have to be kind of careful about that because the moment that you want to do something beyond just serverless, you're kind of locked into those frameworks. So like choosing something like CDK or Plumie would definitely be beneficial for you in that sense, because it gives you that lateral movement into other services that you want to adopt within AWS, or or if you're using serverless within Azure, like Azure Functions, you could use Azure App Services later on, or you may want to use Azure SQL. You have the option to do that. And not only that, because programming languages are inherently extensible, we've actually created these higher order component packages. So specifically for AWS, because that's just one of our really popular ones, but we're also trying to make similar packages for Azure and GCP as well. But in AWS, we actually, even in GCP, we do this today, but you can do things like if you've ever written JavaScript and you've written event callbacks, we've actually enabled that natively within Pulumi. So you could do things like you've uploaded a bucket object. And if you're familiar with S3 buckets, if you upload a file to the bucket, you can take an action whenever you upload a new file. And because AWS fires a notification that a new file or object has been uploaded. And so we provide you with a similar interface that is kind of native to TypeScript, or idiomatic to TypeScript, which is in the form of like callbacks. So you can do bucket object dot on new object created, then you can provide your callback, and then Pulumi will do the heavy lifting to wire up your callback with the appropriate like CloudWatch notifications and such. And so I definitely do recommend taking a look at Pulumi from a serverless perspective, and specifically we've written a package called AWS X. It's an extensions package on top of AWS, which simplifies a lot of things, a lot of boilerplate things involved in creating lambdas, creating ECS like container clusters, and doing things with Docker and stuff like that. So definitely check that out.
question as a follow-up to that regarding, you mentioned being language agnostic. It sounds like Plumie is also infrastructure agnostic. Is it possible within projects to be, mixing infrastructure in the sense of saying, give me some S3 buckets over here, but go ahead and spin up a Backblaze B2 bucket to dump all this data that we'll probably never need? Is that a typical use pattern, or is that possible?
Yeah, so that is definitely possible. You can mix providers even within a single project. So you could say that, you can say that I want to create S3 buckets, but then the pricing on a cold storage in, I don't know, Azure or GCP is cheaper. And so maybe you want to move some of the objects over there and put it in a cold pricing tier. You can definitely do that. It's just a matter of when you create the project in Plumie, you would configure the credentials that is appropriate for each of those cloud providers. And so that's one of the benefits of using something like even Terraform, because you're not tied to a specific cloud. But of course, between Terraform and Plumie, depending on what you like, you could be using something that's programming language based or DSL based.
Any other questions from the live stream, Arsh?
Nope, the stream looks good.
All right. Well, if no one has anything else, we can leave it there tonight. Thank you so much, Praneet, for doing this. Very short notice. This was a great overview, and I'm sure I'm going to have a ton of questions to ask you by email tomorrow. But really appreciate the presentation.
Yep, of course. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming over and listening to the presentation. See you all. Good night.
All right. Did we have any other announcements for the go to the order? Anybody? Okay.
We lost Jeff.
We did.
Yeah.
But I think we can leave it there for next month. Let's see. It's going to be one of two speakers. I'm hoping Claire Cortell is going to join us next month to talk about mapping. But we will let you guys know in the newsletter soon. All right. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Good night.